This first one happened when he was with the Boston Celtics. Now, they were up against their rivals at the time, the Los Angeles Lakers. The Celtics had a 6-point lead with 9 minutes left in the third quarter when a Lakers player dove for a loose ball while they were on offense. He was able to recover it, but Rondo still tried to grab it anyways while he was on the ground. Right after Rondo did that, Kobe Bryant was walking over to his teammate who was on the ground and apparently said something because Rondo just shoved him back randomly. Bryant then started pointing right at Rondo and the two began arguing for a little bit. It didn't end up getting much more intense from there as the two were split up fairly quickly, but Rondo was still handed a technical foul for the unnecessary shove on Kobe. But Kobe didn't receive any punishment because he reacted calmly and didn't lay a finger on Rondo after he was pushed. He definitely kept himself calmer than most people when they go up against Rondo, but this next fight was far from just calm and peaceful. Rondo was still with Boston here, and they were getting crushed by the Brooklyn Nets, losing by 16 with 20 seconds left in the first half. The Celtics badly needed a spark if they wanted to come back, but things were simply not going their way. Kevin Garnett was driving to the rim to attempt a layup when he was deterred by Chris Humphries. Garnett ended up going down pretty hard, and it seemed like a much harder foul than it truly was. But right as the refs went to blow the whistle, Rondo flew into the frame and shoved Humphries straight back, and Humphries didn't back down. The two ended up getting locked on top of one another, and while tangled up, actually went into the first few rows of the stands. This obviously broke out into a huge fight between both sides, with all players and staff from either side desperately trying to jump in there and break them up. But while Rondo and Humphries were fighting in the middle of it all, Garnett could be seen throwing an elbow at another player to get himself some separation, making this a doozy of a play to review for the officials. There were so many players that needed to be punished for their actions, and primarily Rondo. Because, to be honest, without that shove from him, no fight would have even broken loose. Sure, Garnett would still have been upset, but I think that would have been a whole lot better than an entire team versus team fight that sprawled out into the stands. This next fight ended up taking up the entire court and involved the entire team from both sides. Rajon Rondo was on the Los Angeles Lakers, and the team was down by 1 point against the Houston Rockets with 4 minutes left in the game. Something occurred on one end of the floor that involved James Harden getting into a heated argument with Brandon Ingram. The two were going back and forth until they were finally separated by the rest of the teammates on the court. Cameras were looking over at Ingram being held back and Harden walking away from the pile, but randomly the crowd started going wild. It turns out during that whole breakup of the previous fight, Rondo and Chris Paul started to heat up in their own personal argument that caused a small scuffle on the other end. It was all just words and arguing as usual until Rondo unleashed not one, but 2 punches at Paul, landing one of them directly to his jaw. Immediately, everybody flew in to break them up and get them away from one another, and cameras had to flip between Paul and Rondo being contained until the officials could get everything sorted out. But guess what? That wasn't even all of it. Remember how Ingram was being held back and walked away from the fight? Well, Carmelo Anthony was following Ingram, and at first it looked like he was trying to help, but after the Rondo incident, it actually seemed like Melo and Ingram were having their own argument, which caused Melo to be taken away from Ingram. So in a span of just a few minutes, there were 3 different fights on one court, involving just the players on the floor at that time, which is absolute madness. But the craziest part of all of that was the fact that Rondo actually swung and connected on a punch. Rondo was then forced to sit out the next 3 games due to suspension, with Chris Paul picking up a 2-game suspension and Brandon Ingram getting 4. Our next fight resulted in an ejection, but there were no further suspensions handed out. The New Orleans Pelicans were beating the Lakers by nearly 20 points late in the first quarter, and things were getting a bit chippy for the Lakers. Rondo was on the Pelicans at this time and was handed the task of guarding Isaiah Thomas, the former Boston Celtics star point guard. Looking back at the previous few possessions between these two guys, they were giving each other small shoves and pushes and grabs for quite a while. Then, after one possession, Thomas had had enough. He stormed up to Rondo as if he was going to get into a fight, and officials instantly pulled them apart from one another. Thomas was still furious, but he didn't swing or keep the argument going. He was just visibly upset while walking away from the pile. Rondo was still arguing his case that he did nothing wrong, but at this point there was no use. The referees had thrown Rondo out of the game because he'd already had 1 technical foul in just that quarter alone. Thomas was handed a technical also, but the refs may have handed him a second one just a few minutes later because he was still arguing with an official over what Rondo was doing. For once, this fight started and ended pretty quickly, which isn't something you see every day, especially when we're talking about Rajon Rondo. But hey, sometimes these fights don't involve swings, but they're just as heated as some of the other ones. Just like in this fight against Draymond Green and the Golden State Warriors. Rondo was still on New Orleans at the time, and the score was just 7-6, very early in the game. A whistle was blown as Rondo was taking the ball up the court, so he decided to take a step or two and try to get a practice shot while nobody was around. Green walked over to Rondo and puts his hands up to block it, not allowing Rondo to get his free shot up. That made Rondo a little bit upset, but he tried walking around Green and passing the ball to another official. But Green wasn't taking any chances. He slapped the ball away from Rondo right after it left his hands, and Rondo shoved him instantly. The two then got up into each other's faces and started shoving and yelling, while a few refs had to split them up. This fight makes more sense when you realize that they had actually fought before, quite literally in the previous game, because this was a playoff series. Draymond was seen on the baseline yelling and screaming that the Warriors were winning after yet another shot fell for his team. He was obviously pretty happy at that point until Rondo flew in out of nowhere and gave him a shove. Draymond took a step back but came right back to Rondo as the two got into each other's faces once again and started yelling. They both had a hold of one another, so it wasn't clear whether or not it was going to escalate anytime soon. A few staff members walked over to them but didn't end up needing to split them up. They just kept it to arguing and that was it. But the bad blood was obviously there for these two guys from the very beginning, and I'm sure that it's still there to this day. Just like there had to be bad blood between Rafer Alston and Rondo. The Celtics and the Rockets were squaring up to go head-to-head, with Rondo playing for Boston and Alston on Houston's team. I believe the jump ball went out of bounds, so Houston was setting up for an inbounds pass. Alston was attempting to get separation from Rondo, but while they were doing so, Rondo shoved Alston's arm away, prompting the two to start arguing right in the middle of the court. They had to be separated, with Rondo looking like he was going to start swinging, even getting himself into a fighting stance right at half court. I mean, there had to be some previous altercations between these guys that we just don't know about because, well, the game literally hadn't even started yet. There was still 12 minutes remaining in the first quarter. The only thing that happened was the jump ball, and nobody was able to touch it because it went out of bounds. This was one of the weirdest altercations that I've seen in a long time. I mean, I feel like we never get the privilege of seeing a fight between two NBA players occur before the clock even starts running. But anyways, Alston walked away pretty easily, though he wasn't too happy about the altercation. Meanwhile, Rondo looked pretty angry, as if there was something said during that one play. The result of the play was both of them receiving technical fouls and the game finally starting. So, a decent ending to just an average fight.